Hey everyone, welcome back. It's Christmas time and I love Christmas. I love Christmas lights. I always have. One thing I don't really love though is putting them up every year and taking them back down. It's scary, it's dangerous, it's time consuming. I know I'm not the only one who feels that way. The permanent Christmas light fad is going crazy in suburbia right now. But I've been working on this problem for a long time, honestly, even back a couple of decades. I'm going to show you a sketch that I made nearly 2 decades ago trying to solve for the permanent Christmas light problem right there, long before they were ever popular. I'm not sharing that out of any sense of bitterness at all. Not that I would have wanted to be sleeping on piles of money every night for the last 2 decades. Permanent Christmas lights do solve a problem, though. They are all over our neighborhood here, and I'm not saying I wouldn't want them on my house someday, but it is almost maybe a little too cliche nowadays, and it's almost too easy. You can just walk over to a closet and flip on a light switch, and I wanted something that would maybe show just a little bit more Christmas spirit, a little bit more effort. I also wanted something that didn't require getting up on a roof. I wanted something that's a little bit more modular so I could sort of mix and match them a little bit in the future if I, come up with some new configurations, and would also make them easy to set up and take down. I wanted something that was flexible, so I wanted something that maybe wasn't necessarily perfectly Christmas specific, but that could be used for other occasions, maybe other holidays, maybe backyard parties, weddings, who knows? And I just wanted to be a little bit different. I wanted to have something that would maybe stand out just a hair. So I started tinkering around with programmable and individually addressable LEDs about a year ago when we were finishing our basement, and built a little movie theater as part of the renovation. That was kind of where the seeds for this idea were planted. I started really imagining what else I could do with LEDs and have, maybe about 400 other projects and other places in the house I'd like to put them, but that was kind of where it all got started. I could get a set of 500 lights. I thought 500 was a good constraint to begin with. It wouldn't be too unruly, too hard to control, and would give me some design constraints, which, as one of my former bosses at a design firm said, is the springboard of design. So I started pondering a bunch of different shapes and configurations that would meet those requirements. The first and maybe most obvious idea is a Christmas tree. You see those around a lot. They can be very cool. Some of the animations you can do on a Christmas tree, especially the spiral effects, I love seeing those on Christmas trees. But I'm not totally in love with it. Again, it's done a lot. It's also very Christmas specific, which violated one of the principles that I set out with. So I started leaning away from that idea, moved maybe toward arches for a little while in my thinking. Arches that kind of bounce along a sidewalk, almost like sidewalk runners. Those are kind of cool and interesting. There are tutorials on how to do those. It's also a little bit more abstract, but you can do some really cool animations there. But the material seemed a little tricky. Again, it wasn't entirely novel. And I was just looking for something maybe a little bit more of a centerpiece in some way. Those feel like a good addition to something that's already there, but it doesn't make a very good focal point. So continuing on the topic of arches, I then started pondering about maybe arches that go over a walkway or a tunnel of sorts. Again, very interesting. I think those can be a very powerful experience. I've walked through a few myself that have just really blown my mind and would love to do that someday. As an initial project, though, also with a limit of 500 lights, the 500 light limit was maybe a little too constraining on a project of that scale. Also, taking on just the structural engineering challenges of building something like that without having it fall over on somebody sounded a little daunting, at least from the get-go. I'm certainly not afraid. I'm not going to shy away from that permanently, but just another constraint to consider. Then I started thinking maybe about like a sphere, just like a giant sphere. Could be super cool. You could do a lot of the same kinds of twisty rotational animations that you could get on a Christmas tree, but it's not Christmas specific anymore. It is just beginning to think about that, though, became very logistically challenging. Building that structure, getting the math right, circular, spherical math sounds hard. And anyway, I decided to shelve that one too for that reason. But the idea of circles started to stick in my head a little bit. I've seen very cool things done with sets of concentric circles of lights. That's a very interesting thing to me. Or even circles with the lights facing outward, sort of like in a cylindrical fashion. That idea started to take hold in my mind a little bit more strongly after I watched a YouTube video of a house that had an animated LED show where they had these neoclassical Roman columns on their house that they had wrapped completely in LEDs and had done some really cool animations with that. So I love both the directionality and dimensionality of that, where the lights point different directions all the way around, so you can do, some circular movements with that, and also just that there's some 3D depth to that. So on that topic, I actually started ideating on that one a little bit more seriously. So I did as I often do when I'm thinking in dimensional factors, I popped open Blender. So I built a little system that allowed me to assign LEDs to points on a shape. And so I started playing around with cylinders, and then even started thinking, the principles of modularity with having these rings of lights would allow me the flexibility that I needed to then make something that was sort of holiday specific, which sounds like it violates the principle, but actually I felt didn't in the end, because the modularity of it allowed me to reuse them. But in this fashion, I felt like I could build several rings and then stack them in such a sense that they could form a Christmas tree, and it would also be a little different from the conventional LED Christmas lights that you see, where they string strands from a pole outward to an outer circumference at the bottom. Instead, this would be a series of stacked rings, which felt like a different experience than that. So that started to be really appealing, and I went down this road for a long time. But then I was digging around in some old notes and came across an idea I had over 2 years ago. This concept of having poles of LEDs that could be used for different purposes in different ways throughout the year. The vision I had was these poles of LEDs that I could, in the summertime, snap into fence posts in my backyard. And then in the wintertime, when I'm not going outside and using the backyard, I could move them into the front yard and make a holiday show out of those. So I really started pondering heavily on that concept. Now, I don't even have a fence yet. I've always intended to, and I'm going to get to that someday, especially as my little kids begin to grow up. But that concept was just really appealing to me, to have like this multi-purpose unit of light in a pole form. So I started visualizing that a little bit. So I started just with some light poles and with lights from top to bottom. And that became actually a pretty compelling idea to me, because it can be a pretty stunning effect with the repetition of the shapes. But also when you bring them together and animate them in harmony with each other, then they become one unit in a way that is pretty pretty impactful, pretty stunning, and can act as sort of a centerpiece like that, as I mentioned before. I did start iterating on that just a little bit more. One component, again, like I said, this could make a really stunning focal point, but I wondered, could I bring even maybe more of an impactful center focal point kind of a touch to it? So then I started looking at what it might be like to have a grid involved as well. So take a pole and maybe not start the lights all the way down at the bottom, start them a little higher up, which has a lot of practical purposes too. In an area where we get snow, it kind of keeps the lights up off the ground a little bit. But then adding a grid component to it, which would allow some flexibility for imagery, since the pixel density is a little tighter, a higher resolution display that would allow some images to be displayed. So I looked at a couple of different versions of that. Like this one, the difference might be pretty subtle. I don't know, this versus this, and really the only difference here is the addition of 2 extra poles and the removal of 2 columns from the grid. So increasing the horizontal span with an extra pole for a total of 12 poles and a narrower grid in the middle. And I went back and forth on this for a long time, but ultimately decided to go back to this version primarily for that reason. It's a stronger focal point in the center and also gives me greater flexibility and just a few extra pixels to be able to display an image or an animation of some point. So it felt like the right move to go here. So working within the constraints of 500 pixels, trying to break these down into even columns leaves you with, honestly, very few options. One of the most obvious factors there is 50, and 50 breaks down into only 4 factors, 1 and 50 and 2 and 25. So each of these columns is 25 pixels tall. Another factor that I wanted to incorporate, as I mentioned before, was some dimensionality, which in this case, it becomes pretty flat when you're talking about poles and grids and things. But in this design, I did have them staggered in some fashion just to bring some of that dimensionality to it, so I could use just a little bit of the Z depth on my lawn. But then I ran actually into a little bit of an electrical challenge that changed the design. So I had all of these poles built and had tested them each individually, one by one, and all of them were working great. But then I strung them together, and I had the power supply in the middle, where here, for example, it would be in the center where the grid was. That's where my power supply is. And so I have one power line running off to the left and one off to the right, so there are 5 columns attached to each line. On paper, the distance seemed pretty manageable. It wasn't a crazy, super long distance between each pole, so I didn't feel like there would be any power drop-off issues, but one thing I failed to consider is that the power needs to both run up and down each pole. Each pole is about 7 feet tall. So the power, instead of running only 7 feet, had to run 14 feet for each pole. And then to accommodate some of these staggered distances and the modularity and flexibility that I had envisioned, I made connecting wires that were 6 feet long so that I could, again, move them around anywhere I wanted to. And once I got those all strung together with the power going up and down and the 6 feet in between each pole, it ended up being around 75 feet from the power supply to the last LED. And so my most extreme outward edges, those last poles on the line, got pretty glitchy. They weren't running the animation smoothly. They were flickering, a little dim. And I was worried that there was a more serious electrical problem at play there, but it turned out to be just the length. So in the end, I actually didn't end up being able to stagger them in depth, and they are out on my lawn right now, just in a straight line. And I was able to cut those connecting wires down to about 1.5 feet apiece, which brought the total length down to around 50 feet, which was enough to get the power sufficiently to the extreme ends. So those are all my notes on the design of the display. This is going to be a multi-part series, so if you want to follow along for the rest of the journey, go ahead and subscribe. There will be additional units on the actual physical construction of the display, another unit on the wiring and the electrical challenges, which is going to be a pretty serious unit. There's a lot to talk about there. I'm also probably going to explore a little bit about what it's like to code the chip that I used. And one thing I didn't mention before, but I actually kind of released this almost in a software-like fashion in 2 versions. There was a V1 release for Halloween, which actually only involved the poles. That was my goal, to get the poles ready to go for Halloween, and then it got a V2 upgrade for Christmas where I added the grid. So there will be an extra module on how I actually constructed the grid after the fact. So subscribe to see all the rest of the pieces of this, and thanks for watching.